Cowboy took in a stray Apache girl, not knowing her mother would steal his heart. Wild West story. Luke McAllister wiped the sweat from his brow as he led his horse along the narrow path that ran beside his small ranch. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dry earth and the faint aroma of wildflowers that somehow survived the harsh summer heat. Luke had lived on this land for most of his life, alone except for his animals and the occasional traveler passing through. He liked it that way, quiet, predictable, safe. He had just finished checking on his herd when a sudden movement in the underbrush caught his eye. Luke froze, squinting into the shadows. At first he thought it might be a coyote or maybe one of the deer that sometimes wandered too close to the fences. But this was different. The movement was too deliberate, too hesitant, like someone was trying very hard not to be seen. Luke dismounted, letting his reins fall over his arm and walked cautiously toward the spot. As he approached, he saw her. A small figure huddled behind a broken log, her dark hair matted with dirt and leaves. Her clothes were torn, far too large for her tiny frame, and her big, dark eyes stared at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She looked no older than 12. Luke felt a strange pull in his chest, a mix of concern and something else he couldn't quite name. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his voice low so as not to frighten her. "It's okay. You're safe." The girl flinched and took a small step back, hugging her knees to her chest. She didn't speak English, or if she did, she didn't understand him. Instead, she pointed to herself and whispered a word he didn't recognize. Luke crouched down to her level. He didn't want to scare her, but he also knew he couldn't leave her there alone, not with night coming and wild animals roaming. "Little Star," he said gently, improvising a name for her, hoping the sound might bring some comfort. "I'll call you Little Star. You can come with me. I won't hurt you." She hesitated for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of danger. Luke could feel the tension radiating from her, but he also sensed a flicker of hope. Slowly, almost tentatively, she stepped forward. Luke held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her small fingers were cold and trembling, but she didn't pull away. The ride back to his homestead was quiet. Little Star clung to the front of the saddle as Luke guided the horse along the winding trail. She glanced around nervously, her eyes wide as if expecting someone, or something, to appear from the shadows at any moment. Luke didn't speak much, letting her take in the scenery, the endless stretch of golden plains, and the distant mountains that marked the horizon. When they reached his ranch, Luke led her to the small cabin that had been his home for years. The place was simple, a single wooden room with a fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed covered with a patchwork quilt. Despite its modesty, Luke had kept it clean and welcoming. He knelt on the floor and gestured toward a chair, then pointed to the bed. "Sit there if you want," he said, "or lie down, you must be tired." Little Star looked around, still unsure, but she did as he suggested, perching carefully on the edge of the bed. Luke went to the kitchen corner, where a pot of stew was simmering over the fire. The smell of meat and vegetables filled the room. He ladled some into a small bowl and handed it to her. She sniffed it cautiously, then took a tentative bite. Her eyes widened and she nodded slightly, a small sign of gratitude. As she ate, Luke watched her carefully. There was something about her that reminded him of his own childhood, of simpler days when life wasn't so complicated. She was quiet, observing, and though she couldn't speak his language, he felt as if she understood him. He knew that taking in a stranger, especially a child, was a big responsibility. But something inside him had told him the moment he saw her hiding in the woods that he couldn't just walk away. After the meal, Luke showed her around the cabin, pointing out where she could wash up, where to hang her clothes, and where the animals slept. She followed him closely, mimicking his movements and occasionally laughing quietly at some new thing she discovered. Luke couldn't remember the last time he had felt such a strange mixture of worry and joy. The fear in her eyes had slowly begun to soften, replaced by curiosity and cautious trust. Night fell, and the wind howled outside the cabin. Luke built a small fire in the hearth, and the flickering light cast shadows on the wooden walls. Little Star sat close to the flames, warming her hands, her eyes fixed on the dancing light. Luke sat across from her, keeping a watchful eye on the door, listening to every creak and rustle outside. In moments like this, the Wild West could feel both beautiful and dangerous, a place where life could change in an instant. "Sleep now," Luke said softly. "I'll keep watch." "No one will hurt you." She nodded slowly, curling up under the quilt. Luke could see her chest rise and fall steadily, the first sign of real relaxation he had noticed since finding her. He sat back and let out a quiet sigh. Taking in a stray child was not something he had planned for. Yet, as he watched her drift into sleep, he realized that life on the frontier was unpredictable. It was messy, sometimes frightening, and often lonely, but moments like this reminded him why he had stayed. The next morning brought sunlight streaming through the cabin window. Little Star was awake early, stretching and blinking against the bright light. Luke had prepared breakfast, and she approached it cautiously, as if not quite sure it was real. She tasted the food, then smiled, a small, radiant smile that filled the cabin with warmth. Luke smiled back, feeling a connection growing between them, one that didn't need words. Over the following days, Luke taught Little Star how to care for the animals. She learned quickly, her small hands proving surprisingly adept at feeding the chickens and grooming the horses. She listened intently when he explained chores and daily routines. Luke noticed she had a spark of determination and intelligence that reminded him of himself at her age, though she had faced hardships he could barely imagine. Despite their slow start, Luke found himself thinking of her often when he was alone. He worried about her safety, her well-being, and whether anyone was looking for her. But he also felt a growing sense of purpose, a bond that went beyond mere responsibility. Little Star was no longer just a stranger. She had become part of his life in a way he hadn't expected, and he knew that nothing would ever feel quite the same again. Evening came again, and with it, the familiar hush of the prairie. Luke and Little Star sat outside the cabin, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The sky was painted in shades of pink and violet, and the first stars began to appear. Little Star pointed at one of them and whispered a word in her language. Luke chuckled softly. "Little Star, huh? I guess it suits you," he said. She nodded, smiling faintly, and for the first time Luke felt a glimmer of hope that together they could face whatever the Wild West might throw at them. He didn't know the full story of where she came from or what dangers might still be out there, but he knew one thing for certain: he would protect her, no matter what. The prairie was quiet, the night full of possibilities and unknowns. But inside the small cabin, a new beginning had quietly taken root. A lonely cowboy and a frightened child had found each other, and neither would ever be the same again. The mornings at Luke McAllister's homestead had a peaceful rhythm. Sunlight spilled over the hills, casting long golden rays across the dusty prairie. Little Star woke early, her small hands brushing sleep from her eyes as she peeked out the cabin window. Outside, the horses grazed lazily, the chickens clucked and pecked at the ground, and the wind carried the familiar scent of dry grass and wildflowers. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Luke had already begun his chores. He moved with the ease of someone who had spent years in the unforgiving Wild West, feeding the animals, checking fences, and tending to the small garden he had managed to grow despite the harsh conditions. When Little Star stepped outside, she hesitated at first, unsure how she could help. Luke noticed her hesitation but said nothing, only nodding in her direction. "Come on, Little Star," he said gently. "The chickens won't feed themselves." She shuffled over, her small feet stirring up the dust. Luke showed her how to scatter the feed evenly, and though she stumbled at first, she quickly got the hang of it. Her face lit up when the chickens pecked eagerly at the food she had spread. Luke chuckled, his heart warming at the sight. "You've got a knack for this," he said. "Looks like you were meant to be here." Little Star didn't respond in words, but she smiled shyly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Luke realized she might never fully understand English at first, but that wasn't important. Actions and expressions often said more than words ever could. Over the next few days, Luke began teaching her more than just chores. He showed her how to groom the horses, how to check for ticks and sores, and how to ride without fear. Little Star was a quick learner, her small hands surprisingly steady and confident. Luke watched her closely, impressed by her determination. She asked questions in her own way, pointing at objects and using gestures, and Luke did his best to answer. "You see," he said one morning as they walked along the fence line, "this is called a corral. It keeps the horses safe at night." Little Star nodded, her dark eyes wide with curiosity. She repeated the word corral, her pronunciation slightly off but close enough to make Luke smile. He clapped his hands lightly. "Good job, you're learning fast." Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them grew stronger. Luke found himself sharing stories of his own childhood, tales of cattle drives, storms, and the simple pleasures of frontier life. Little Star listened intently, her eyes sparkling with fascination. Sometimes she laughed at his stories, and sometimes she shook her head in disbelief, clearly amazed at the hardships he had faced. One afternoon, as they rested in the shade of a large oak tree, Luke noticed Little Star staring off into the distance. He followed her gaze and saw a faint trail in the dust, signs that someone had passed through recently. His heart tightened slightly. "Do you see that?" he asked softly. "Looks like someone's been around here." Little Star tensed, gripping his hand. Luke realized that even though she was beginning to trust him, the fear of being alone in the world still lingered. He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry," he said. "I've got you. Nobody's going to hurt you here." She nodded, her small hand still holding his tightly. Luke felt a protective surge of responsibility. This wasn't just about chores and daily routines anymore. He was now her guardian, her protector, and he intended to keep it that way. As the days continued, Luke also noticed that Little Star had her own ways of showing affection. She would quietly mimic his actions, handing him tools, feeding the animals, or tidying up the cabin without being asked. Occasionally, she would bring him small tokens from around the ranch, a shiny stone, a feather, or a tiny wildflower, placing them carefully on the table with a shy smile. Luke couldn't help but laugh at her earnestness, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. Despite the growing peace at the homestead, Luke remained cautious. He knew that the Wild West was unpredictable, and the appearance of a child like Little Star couldn't remain unnoticed forever. There were travelers, hunters, and sometimes troublemakers passing through the area. He kept a careful eye on the horizon and made sure the cabin door was always secure at night. Yet, even with all the caution, he found himself enjoying the quiet companionship more than he had expected. One evening, after a long day of riding and chores, Luke and Little Star sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the hills. The sky was painted in brilliant hues of red, orange, and purple, and the first stars began to twinkle. Little Star pointed at a bright star above, whispering the word she had repeated since he first met her. Luke nodded, smiling. "You're right," he said softly. "You really are a little star." She smiled back, the warmth in her expression making Luke feel an unfamiliar sense of hope and contentment. For the first time in years, his home felt complete, even if it was just the two of them. But as peaceful as life seemed, Luke couldn't shake a feeling that their quiet days might not last forever. One morning, he found tracks near the edge of his property, fresh horse prints and signs that someone had been moving cautiously through the grass. He studied them carefully, recognizing the careful, deliberate pattern of a skilled rider. Luke's stomach tightened. Someone was looking for Little Star. He didn't want to alarm her, not yet. Instead, he continued with the day's chores, keeping a close eye on her while subtly preparing for the possibility of visitors. Little Star, oblivious to the danger, continued her routine, laughing as she chased chickens and helped tend the garden. Luke couldn't help but marvel at her resilience. Even after all she had endured, she remained brave and cheerful, a small beacon of light in the harsh world around them. Days later, a rider was spotted on the horizon, moving slowly and deliberately toward the homestead. Luke felt a flicker of unease. He instructed Little Star to stay inside the cabin while he approached the visitor. As he drew closer, he realized that the figure wasn't a threat, at least not in a dangerous way. It was a woman on horseback, tall, strong, with eyes that seemed to search the land with purpose. She stopped at the edge of Luke's property and watched quietly. Luke approached slowly, raising a hand in greeting. "Can I help you?" he called out. The woman studied him for a moment before speaking, her voice calm but firm. "I'm looking for a child," she said. "A girl named Little Star." Luke's heart skipped a beat. He knew, without a doubt, that this was the mother, the family member who had been searching for her daughter. He felt a surge of protectiveness for the girl inside the cabin, mixed with curiosity about the woman who had traveled so far to find her. Over the next few days, Luke observed the woman from a distance. He saw the determination in her movements, the careful attention she paid to the land, and the gentle way she spoke when she thought no one was watching. There was something about her strength and presence that intrigued him, even though he hadn't yet spoken to her directly. Meanwhile, Little Star continued to grow more comfortable in her new home. She learned the routines, helped with chores, and even began to imitate Luke's riding techniques. She laughed more freely, her dark eyes sparkling with joy. Luke often found himself watching her, feeling a deep satisfaction at seeing her happy. Yet he also knew that soon, the appearance of her mother would change everything. Life at the homestead continued in this delicate balance. Luke taught Little Star about the world around her, the importance of caring for animals, respecting the land, and finding courage in unexpected situations. Little Star, in turn, brought laughter, curiosity, and warmth into Luke's life, slowly turning the lonely ranch into a home filled with life and hope. As the days passed, Luke couldn't help but think about the woman he had glimpsed, the mother searching for Little Star. There was a sense of anticipation, a quiet tension that hung over the homestead like the stillness before a storm. Luke knew that when they finally met, everything would change, and he felt a strange excitement mixed with anxiety at what that change might bring. For now, though, he focused on the present. Little Star needed him, and he was determined to protect her, teach her, and make her feel safe. Together, they continued their routines, learning from each other, growing closer with each passing day. Luke realized that life in the Wild West was unpredictable, full of hardships and surprises, but moments like these made it all worthwhile. And in those quiet mornings, warm afternoons, and star-filled nights, a bond was forming, one that would shape not only their days ahead but the journey of their hearts, forever intertwining the lives of a lonely cowboy and a brave little girl he had taken in. The morning sun rose slowly over the hills, spilling golden light across the prairie. Luke McAllister was already awake, tending to the horses, when a distant shape caught his eye. A lone rider moved steadily toward his homestead, kicking up dust in the early light. Luke's heart skipped a beat. He had seen many travelers pass by, but something about this rider felt different, deliberate, purposeful, and unafraid. He tightened his grip on the reins and nudged his horse forward. As the figure drew closer, he could see that it was a woman, tall and strong, with sharp eyes that scanned the land like someone searching for something precious. Her long, dark hair flowed in the wind, and her clothes, though simple, suggested she had traveled far and carried a weight of experience that Luke recognized instantly. The woman stopped at the edge of the homestead, her horse stamping the ground nervously. Luke approached cautiously, hand hovering near the hilt of the knife he carried, though he had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. "Good morning," he called, keeping his voice steady. "Can I help you?" The woman's eyes locked on his. For a long moment she said nothing, only studying him with an intensity that made Luke feel as if she could see through his very soul. Then, in a voice calm but firm, she spoke. "I'm looking for a child," she said. "A girl named Little Star." Luke felt a mixture of relief and caution. Relief because the girl had family searching for her, and caution because he didn't know the woman's intentions. Yet there was something in her presence, strength, determination, and a quiet confidence, that intrigued him. "You mean the girl I took in?" Luke asked carefully. "She's here, safe." The woman's eyes softened for a brief moment, though they remained watchful. She nodded slowly. "My name is Aya," she said. "She's my daughter. I've been searching for her for weeks." Luke's heart tightened. He imagined the fear and anxiety that must have filled this woman as she searched tirelessly for her child. He also realized that her arrival would change everything, for him, for Little Star, and for the life they had been building together. Aya dismounted her horse gracefully, moving with a natural ease and strength. She approached the cabin, her eyes never leaving Luke's. For the first time, he noticed the subtle way she carried herself, confident, capable, and yet gentle in her movements. Luke found himself momentarily at a loss for words, a rare feeling for a man who had spent years alone on the prairie. "Thank you for keeping her safe," Aya said, her voice steady but with a hint of relief. "I've been worried sick." Luke nodded. "She's been, well. She's adjusting. She's strong, smart, and brave. I've been taking care of her." Aya's gaze softened and she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I can see that. I can tell she's in good hands." Little Star, curious about the new presence, peeked from behind the cabin door. She had watched the woman arrive and instinctively knew that this was someone important. When she saw Aya, her eyes widened with recognition, and she ran forward, calling out in her own language. Aya knelt, arms open, and Little Star ran into them without hesitation. Luke watched quietly, a mixture of admiration and curiosity swelling inside him. He had expected a tense reunion, perhaps tears or fear, but instead, he saw a bond that was immediate and undeniable. Aya held her daughter close, whispering words Luke could not understand, but the emotions were clear: love, relief, and a quiet strength. After a few moments, Aya looked up at Luke. "Thank you again," she said softly. "I know it's not easy to care for someone else's child." Luke shrugged, trying to appear casual, though he felt a strange warmth at her words. "She's special," he said. "She makes it easy to care for her." Aya's eyes flicked toward him, and Luke felt a jolt of something unfamiliar, a connection, perhaps, or curiosity. She seemed to study him carefully, taking in his rugged features, his weathered hands, and the quiet strength in his posture. Luke, in turn, found himself captivated by her presence. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of determination, intelligence, and a quiet softness, that drew him in. Over the next few days, Luke and Aya began to navigate their new reality. Little Star stayed close to her mother, but it was clear that she had grown attached to Luke as well. The dynamics were delicate, a careful balance between family, trust, and the life they had all shared in the past weeks. Luke watched as Aya taught Little Star the ways of her people, sharing stories, traditions, and small lessons about the world beyond the homestead. Luke found himself learning from Aya too. He admired her resilience, her strength, and the calm way she faced challenges. There was a quiet magnetism in her presence that he couldn't ignore. He noticed the way she moved, how she handled the animals, and even the small gestures she made, like brushing a stray hair from Little Star's face or speaking softly to calm the horses. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Luke found himself walking alongside Aya toward the corral. Little Star was tending to the horses nearby, laughing softly as she guided one into its stall. Luke and Aya spoke little at first, each aware of the unspoken tension between them. "You've done a lot for her," Aya said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I can see she's safe and happy." Luke shrugged, though he felt a warmth spread through him at her words. "I just wanted her to have a chance. She deserved that." Aya's eyes softened, and for a moment she looked at him not as a stranger, but as someone who had shared in her child's life, someone who had protected her when she couldn't be there. Luke felt a flutter of something unfamiliar, a connection he hadn't anticipated. Days passed, and Luke noticed more about Aya. Her quiet confidence, the way she handled herself in the open prairie, her laughter that carried like music across the fields, all of it began to draw him in. He found himself thinking of her when he wasn't around, imagining how she moved, how her voice sounded when she spoke to little Star, how her eyes lit up with emotion. But alongside these feelings was a sense of responsibility and caution. Aya was little Star's mother, and Luke knew that he could not act on these emotions without care. He respected her, admired her, and felt a growing connection, but he also understood the importance of patience. Trust and understanding could not be rushed, especially in a world as harsh and unpredictable as the Wild West. One afternoon, Luke and Aya worked together to repair a section of the fence damaged by a recent storm. The sun beat down on them, and the sweat ran down their faces, but there was a quiet rhythm in their shared labor. Little Star watched from a distance, fascinated by the teamwork between her protector and her mother. She giggled occasionally, shouting small comments in her language which made both Luke and Aya laugh. Through these shared tasks, they began to understand each other better. Luke learned of Aya's courage, her knowledge of the land, and her deep love for her daughter. Aya saw Luke's integrity, his strength, and the kindness that lay beneath his rugged exterior. Slowly, an unspoken bond began to form, a bond built on respect, trust, and a quiet admiration that neither could ignore. As the days turned into weeks, the three of them settled into a new routine. Little Star thrived with both Luke and Aya by her side. She learned the skills of frontier life from Luke and the wisdom of her heritage from her mother. Luke and Aya continued to navigate their feelings carefully, aware of the subtle attraction growing between them. One night as they sat around the fire, little Star asleep nearby, Luke and Aya found themselves talking quietly about the past, the present, and the uncertain future. There was a vulnerability in those conversations, a willingness to share fears and hopes. Luke realized that he had begun to care for Aya in ways he hadn't expected, and he sensed that she might feel the same. Yet, despite these feelings, they remained cautious. Both knew that life on the prairie was unpredictable, and that their primary responsibility was little Star. They could not let their emotions interfere with her safety and well-being. And so, they continued to build trust, share moments of connection, and protect the fragile balance that had formed between them. By the time the sun rose the next morning, casting a warm glow over the homestead, Luke felt a quiet sense of contentment. The arrival of Aya had changed everything. Not only had little Star been reunited with her mother, but Luke had found himself drawn to someone he respected, admired, and trusted. The Wild West was a land of uncertainty, danger, and challenge, but in that small homestead, amidst the horses, the wind, and the golden hills, a new chapter had begun, one filled with hope, connection, and the possibility of love. Life at the homestead settled into a rhythm, but the quiet days of the prairie rarely lasted long. Luke McAllister had grown accustomed to the routines of tending his animals, repairing fences, and teaching little Star the skills she would need to survive in the Wild West. Aya's presence added a new dimension to the ranch, her calm confidence and deep knowledge of the land complementing Luke's practical experience. Together, they created a small world that felt safe, warm, and surprisingly full of laughter. Yet even in this peaceful life, the world beyond the hills remained unpredictable. One morning, Luke noticed a cloud of dust rising in the distance. Squinting, he could see figures on horseback, moving deliberately toward the homestead. His heart tightened. Travelers were common, but these riders had a purposeful gait that suggested more than casual passage. Luke quickly signaled to Aya, who had joined him near the corral, and they both instinctively moved toward the cabin to prepare Little Star. "Stay inside," Luke instructed gently. "Do not come out until I say it's safe." Little Star's eyes widened with fear, but she obeyed, retreating to the cabin with a quick nod. Luke turned to Aya. "We might have trouble," he said. "Stay close." Aya's eyes narrowed, and she placed a protective hand on Little Star's shoulder. "I can handle myself," she said firmly, though Luke could see the tension in her stance. As the riders drew closer, it became clear that they were bandits, notorious in the area for raiding small settlements and lone ranches. Luke's jaw tightened. He had faced dangers before, but the thought of Little Star being caught in the crossfire made his blood boil. Aya, standing beside him, remained calm and alert, her presence a steadying force. When the bandits reached the edge of the property, Luke stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver. Aya followed, her eyes scanning for weaknesses in the riders' formation. "What do you want?" Luke called out, his voice firm. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, sneered. "Just passing through," he said, though Luke could sense the threat in his tone. "Maybe we take a look around your little homestead while we're at it." Luke's hand tightened on his weapon. "I don't think so." The bandits laughed, dismounting and spreading out, their eyes scanning the cabin and corral. Luke felt a surge of anger, but he kept his focus, remembering the most important thing, protecting Little Star and Aya. Aya moved beside him, quietly whispering a plan. "We can use the corral to our advantage, make them think there are more of us than there really are." Luke nodded, impressed by her quick thinking. Together, they moved through the corral, positioning themselves strategically. When the bandits approached, they found themselves facing a coordinated defense, with Luke's sharp aim and Aya's calm presence creating a formidable barrier. The standoff lasted only a few tense moments before the bandits, realizing they were outmatched and wary of potential reinforcements, decided to leave. They mounted their horses and disappeared into the distance, leaving the homestead untouched. Luke exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. Aya glanced at him, her dark eyes meeting his. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Strength, trust, and respect had deepened through this shared trial. "Are you all right?" Luke asked, turning to Little Star, who had peeked out from the cabin. She nodded quickly, her small hand clutching her mother's arm. "I'm safe," she whispered, and Luke smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. In the days that followed, life returned to a cautious normal. Yet the encounter had left its mark. Luke and Aya found themselves more aware of the dangers surrounding them, more appreciative of the quiet moments, and more attentive to each other's presence. Their bond continued to grow, built not only on shared responsibilities, but also on trust, admiration, and subtle affection. But life on the prairie was not without its misunderstandings. One afternoon, while tending to the garden, Little Star accidentally spilled a bucket of water onto Aya's freshly planted seedlings. Aya's face tightened for a moment, and Luke, sensing a misunderstanding, stepped in gently. "It's all right," he said, placing a reassuring hand on Aya's shoulder. "It was just an accident." Aya took a deep breath, her expression softening. "I know," she said quietly, looking at Little Star. "But these plants take time to grow, and I want her to understand that care matters." Luke nodded. "She will. She's learning every day." Little Star looked down, feeling guilty. Luke knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we try again." Through moments like these, Luke realized that raising a child, or sharing the responsibility with her mother, was as much about patience and understanding as it was about teaching skills or survival. Aya, he noticed, approached challenges differently, with a quiet discipline and wisdom born from experience. Luke found himself learning from her, appreciating her perspective and valuing her judgment. As the weeks passed, they faced more small trials. A sudden storm that threatened to flood the garden, a sick calf that needed constant attention, and harsh winds that tore through the homestead, testing the strength of the fences and the cabin. Each challenge required cooperation, trust, and quick thinking. Luke marveled at Aya's calm demeanor and her unwavering focus on solutions. He, in turn, brought his own practical experience and steady presence, and together they managed to protect the homestead and care for little Star. Amid these trials, subtle moments of connection grew between Luke and Aya. One evening, as they repaired a fence together, the sun setting in brilliant hues behind the hills, Luke noticed the way Aya's hair caught the light, the curve of her smile, and the quiet strength in her movements. He felt a warmth he hadn't anticipated, a gentle pull toward her that was both exciting and confusing. Aya, too, seemed aware of the growing connection, though she maintained her composure. She respected Luke's role in little Star's life and valued the trust he had built with her daughter. Yet she could not deny the admiration she felt for him, the way he handled challenges, the patience he showed, and the kindness he extended not only to little Star but to her as well. One night after little Star had fallen asleep, Luke and Aya sat by the fire, the stars twinkling overhead. The prairie was quiet, except for the distant howl of a coyote. They spoke softly, sharing memories, hopes, and dreams. Luke realized that he had begun to care for Aya in ways he hadn't expected. She was not just little Star's mother. She was a remarkable woman who had found her way into his life, bringing with her courage, wisdom, and a quiet beauty that he couldn't ignore. Aya looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I've seen how you care for her," she said softly, "and I appreciate it more than words can say." Luke felt a lump in his throat. "I care about her because she's special," he said, "and I respect you too. I've never met anyone like you." They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken feelings between them growing heavier, more tangible. Both understood that their bond was delicate, built on trust, responsibility, and growing affection. Neither wanted to rush it, yet neither could deny the connection forming in the quiet moments of the prairie nights. Despite the challenges and the dangers that still lingered in the Wild West, Luke and Aya continued to navigate their lives together. Every trial they faced, every storm, every threat, every misunderstanding, brought them closer, teaching them patience, cooperation, and the value of trust. Little Star thrived in this environment, learning the skills of the land from Luke and the wisdom of her heritage from her mother. Through it all, Luke realized that life in the Wild West was unpredictable, harsh, and sometimes frightening. Yet in the midst of the uncertainty, there were moments of beauty, connection, and love. The homestead, once quiet and lonely, had become a place of learning, laughter, and growing affection. Luke, Aya, and little Star were no longer just individuals trying to survive. They were a family, bound together by trust, respect, and the shared challenges of the frontier. As the sun set behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Luke watched Aya and little Star working together to tend the animals. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that despite the trials, they had built something meaningful, something worth protecting and cherishing. And though the future remained uncertain, Luke knew that together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, their bond stronger for every storm, every misunderstanding, and every moment of trust and care. The prairie was quiet that morning, the sun casting a warm glow over the rolling hills. Luke McAllister stood near the corral, brushing one of his horses, when he noticed little Star laughing as she chased a chicken across the yard. Aya, her mother, watched nearby, a gentle smile on her face as she tended to the garden. The scene was peaceful, almost idyllic, a stark contrast to the hardships they had faced just weeks before. Luke felt a surge of gratitude and relief. Life on the prairie had never been easy, but now, with Aya and little Star by his side, it felt full and complete. He realized that the days of solitude and quiet had given way to something far more meaningful: family, trust, and the beginnings of love. Little Star ran toward him, her small face flushed with excitement. "Look, Luke. I taught the horse a new trick," she called out, pointing to the gentle mare he had been training her to ride. Luke chuckled, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "That's wonderful," he said, ruffling her hair. "You're getting better every day." Aya approached, her eyes following Little Star with pride. "She's learning quickly," she said softly, turning to Luke. "And it's because of your patience with her. You've given her confidence." Luke smiled, feeling warmth at her words. "We're teaching each other," he said. "She teaches me patience, and I hope I teach her a little courage." Aya's eyes softened, and for a moment the two of them simply stood together, watching the child who had brought them together. There was a quiet understanding in that shared gaze, a recognition of the bond they had formed through trials, challenges, and countless moments of shared life. As the morning stretched on, Luke and Aya worked together, repairing a section of the fence damaged by a recent windstorm. The rhythm of their labor was steady and harmonious. Little Star assisted, fetching tools and handing them to Luke and her mother, laughing whenever she dropped something or made a small mistake. The sound of her laughter filled the homestead, a melody of joy and innocence that warmed both Luke's and Aya's hearts. By midday the work was complete. Luke leaned on the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. Aya stood beside him, her hair slightly mussed from the wind and sun. Luke felt a flutter in his chest as he looked at her, the way her eyes sparkled in the sunlight, the curve of her smile and the quiet strength she carried. "You did a good job today," he said, his voice low and sincere. Aya glanced at him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "We did a good job," she corrected gently. Luke nodded, feeling the truth in her words. They had faced challenges together, learned from each other, and built something strong and enduring. Their connection had grown through shared labor, shared laughter, and shared care for Little Star. And now, after everything they had been through, it was undeniable that their lives were intertwined in ways neither could ignore. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple, the three of them sat outside the cabin. Little Star rested in Aya's lap, listening intently as her mother told a story from her own childhood. Luke leaned back, arms crossed, watching the interplay of love, warmth, and family around the fire. The moment was simple, yet profound, a testament to everything they had endured and everything they had built together. As darkness fell, Luke and Aya remained seated, the glow of the fire reflecting in their eyes. There was an unspoken tension, a quiet anticipation, and yet also a sense of peace. Luke finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I never expected life to bring me here," he said. "I thought I'd be alone out here forever, but then I found her." He gestured toward Little Star, who was now resting with a contented smile. "And then I found you." Aya's eyes met his, and she smiled, a mixture of affection, respect, and something deeper. "Neither did I," she said quietly. "I thought I would search forever for her and maybe never find peace for myself, but now here we are, together." Luke felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of completeness he hadn't known was possible. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his. Aya didn't pull away. Instead, she held his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if it had always been meant to be. For a moment the world seemed to stand still. The quiet prairie, the distant hills, the crackling fire, and the soft breathing of Little Star, all creating a perfect, serene backdrop. Luke realized that this was more than friendship, more than companionship. It was love built slowly, carefully, through trust, understanding, and shared life. Little Star stirred slightly, lifting her head from her mother's lap. She looked at Luke and Aya, her eyes bright and curious. "Mom," she said softly, "Luke is like family too, isn't he?" Aya smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Yes, he is," she said. "He's part of our family." Little Star's smile widened and she snuggled back into her mother's embrace. Luke felt a sense of pride and joy. He had found a family he could love and protect, and in turn he had been welcomed into one. The hardships of the past, the loneliness, the danger, the uncertainty, seemed distant now, replaced by a present filled with connection and hope. In the days that followed, life at the homestead continued with a newfound sense of balance and harmony. Luke, Aya, and Little Star worked together, played together, and faced small challenges as a team. They mended fences, tended the animals, and cared for the garden, each moment strengthening their bond. Little Star flourished under their guidance, learning the skills of the frontier from Luke and the wisdom of her heritage from her mother. Luke found joy in the simple moments, teaching Little Star to ride without fear, sharing stories with Aya as the sun set, or sitting quietly by the fire watching the stars emerge in the night sky. Aya in turn appreciated Luke's steadiness, his kindness, and the way he made her feel supported and understood. Together, they built not just a home but a life full of trust, love, and shared purpose. One afternoon, while repairing the roof of the cabin, Luke noticed Aya working alongside him, her hands skilled and steady despite the height. He paused, watching her with admiration. "You make everything look so easy," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. Aya glanced at him, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "It's easier when you have a good partner," she replied. Luke felt a warmth spread through him. He realized that he had found not just a companion, but an equal, a partner in life and love, someone who understood the challenges and joys of the Wild West, and someone who shared his values, courage, and heart. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the prairie, Luke, Aya, and Little Star sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of gold and purple. Little Star leaned against both of them, feeling safe, loved, and cherished. Luke and Aya held hands, their fingers intertwined naturally, a silent promise of love, trust, and shared life. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and earth, and the distant hills glowed softly in the fading light. Luke felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that they had weathered storms, faced danger, and overcome misunderstandings. They had built a family, one forged not only by blood or circumstance but by choice, courage, and care. That night, as Little Star slept peacefully between them, Luke and Aya sat by the fire, their hands still clasped. The stars above shone brightly, reflecting the new chapter in their lives, a chapter filled with hope, love, and the promise of countless days spent together on the prairie. Luke realized that sometimes life's greatest rewards came from unexpected beginnings. A lonely cowboy, a lost little girl, and her brave mother had found each other in the vast, untamed Wild West. Together they had built a home, a family, and a life worth living. And in that quiet, star-filled night, Luke knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by love, trust, and the unbreakable ties of family. As dawn broke over the prairie the next day, the golden light spilling over the hills, Luke, Aya, and Little Star stepped outside, ready to greet a new day. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it a promise of adventure, joy, and the endless possibilities of life in the Wild West. And for the first time, Luke felt a profound certainty that with Aya and Little Star by his side, he had truly found where he belonged. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, wild and free, just like the lives they had built together. And together, they faced it not as a lonely cowboy and a single mother, but as a family forged by trust, strengthened by love, and bound forever by the journey that had brought them together.